Again, a really brilliant response to our video from last week. It was great to have seen so many views and shares, and yeah, this is just really exciting, and we're so thrilled really that we have a way to share our knowledge and our experience and our curiosity, I suppose, really with the rest of the world in some way, shape, or form. And yeah, what we're going to talk about this morning is
oh yes, this is a big one, I think. Exciting.
So
memory.
Memory. Okay. Can we remember what we're going to talk about? Okay, so I think to us, this is one of the cornerstones of everything we do, and we have been asking questions for a very, very long time. And I know when I did my master's degree, and I was doing my literary review, and I was looking at existing knowledge and existing research to support the process really that we use, and to understand why did it work so well with people with learning challenges. It left a big gap really, and for a long time that open loop has been trying to be filled.
Indeed.
To really understand, how is it we can meet a student, whether they're a child, a teen, or an adult, doesn't matter, because we're all learning and we're all students for life really, who have these these labels to say that they have difficulty learning, and yet when we speak to them and we find out what they're good at, and this is what we talked about last week, was that whole strengths-based model, how we can why was there this kind of question mark over these really bright, talented people who can do things in an amazing way, and yet would be struggling with something that, if you can read or spell, or you can memorize your maths facts very easily, those things that seem quite simple skills, seem to be lost to them.
Oh, absolutely. And as a teacher, I was always asking, why? What's going on here? And acutely aware that I really didn't have the knowledge about the brain, how the brain works. Certainly my training didn't really go into deep thinking and learning theories, and so we did a little bit about it, but not really that sort of forensic look at what's going on inside the brain.
Absolutely. And I think it's still the same today, which is that, in most courses to become a teacher, whether it's primary or secondary, the focus is very much on teaching and delivery, isn't it, as opposed to actually
and increasingly so, actually, yeah, delivering the curriculum rather than thinking about what's actually happening inside each brain. I mean, bits of work has been done on metacognition, for example, but you and I know that it doesn't quite go deep enough. It doesn't reach the parts that that we think need to be reached. And so, yeah, for me, it's been questioning all the time, and I'm still asking questions. How does the brain work? How do you do that? How does that happen?
Absolutely, and there's a big disconnect, isn't there, from the world of neuroscience and what's happening, on the frontiers of neuroscience in terms of understanding the brain, which still we haven't really touched it, because it's such a complex part of being human. And actually what's happening, really in a classroom with a learner right in front of a teacher. Yes. So there's that big disconnect, and I think, we're hoping to provide some information that for parents and for teachers and even adults who struggle to learn, for them to really start to fill in those pieces of the puzzle, so that they can start to make sense. I mean, metacognition, the way we understand it, is to really understand the process of thinking internally. How does each individual person actually think and learn? Because we talked about neurodiversity last week, and the fact that every brain is wired completely differently. We don't have a standard normal brain that we can measure really everything against. What we're really measuring is input versus output. That's what's kind of happening in education, rather than actually what's going on inside the brain. And it's so complex, and we're not neuroscientists, we're not claiming to know everything, but we're looking for how can we create a model. How could we create? We think we have, actually.
We have.
We have. How can we create a model that actually genuinely helps people to really understand themselves at such a deep level, and to understand where they need to go in their own mind in order to make their learning and their thinking more effective, and really more beneficial for actually the way we live today, especially, which is not memory and regurgitation. It's not following procedures. It's thinking, the whole thing about being able to think outside the box, but also knowing how to think in the box. How do we do those things that are essential? And again, giving choice. So good morning, Lucy. She's just said good morning to us.
Oh, hi, Lucy.
Bless her, she's back watching, which is fantastic.
Oh, faithful friend. Thank you.
She's a teacher, and she's done this training, and she's seen the results as well with the people that she's worked with. So shall we crack on?
Oh, let's go for it.
Okay, so I just need to share my screen. So share what's going on here. That's not the right one. Okay, so what we want to talk about is the whole idea of working memory. And we want to just talk about working memory because when we've had these discussions about what is working memory,
yeah,
we've come across this overlap between two parts of the brain that keep being interchanged as being the same thing, or people keep saying that, you know, it's basically the same thing. But what we want to say is no, they're not. They're actually very, very different. And we often, and I know whenever I've worked with a family and they've brought their child, they often say to me, do you want me to bring the report, their assessment?
Yeah.
And I don't really need to see that, but whenever I have looked at it, often what we see is working memory deficit comes up. And so we were saying, well, what does that actually mean? Because we don't just like the label doesn't really give an answer, and a definition doesn't really give an answer. We want to really kind of go deeper into, well, what specifically does that actually mean in terms of the brain? And recently there was a big long discussion on a Facebook group about dyscalculia, and people talking about, you know, is it really important for my child to know their times tables? That's what kind of parents would say. I know in the academic world it's multiplication facts, but the reality is, you know, generally parents tend to say times tables. And we're not going to talk specifically about times tables, but we are going to talk about the whole concept of learning something so that you can use it later on. Okay, so we're going to give a little challenge. So even if you're watching this as a recording, just please play along. You know, if you just choose to pause and write it down, then you're kind of cheating, and you're not really playing the game. So if you're up for a little game, what we're going to do is we're going to show you a slide. We're going to give you 5 seconds to memorize the slide, what's on the slide. And then at the end of this, we're going to see actually how many of you remember it. Genuinely remember it, because if you write it down, that's cheating. That's not
we don't want that.
So Paula, I'm going to get you to do the timer so you can tell me when to move
on.
Oh
gosh, one second. I'll just count
to 5. It's fine, and then you can just go. Yep, go. Okay.
Okay, off you go. Off.
Okay. So this was what I read an awful lot about when I was doing my research, and Paula, you've done lots and lots of research into this as well, because we often use this in our courses when we're working with teachers and when we work with parents. We've used this really as the basis for understanding, you know, what is working memory. And working memory, this is currently this is the kind of accepted model of memory, and it comes from a guy called Alan Baddeley. So Paula, I'm going to let you explain what.
Oh, thank you for that, Sarah.
That's over to you.
Over to me. Well, this looks a little bit sort of woo. What's going on here? Okay, so Baddeley suggested that when we're learning something, we use sounds. So that's the phonological store. So, for example, particularly when you're learning to spell and to read, it's the sound of the word that's really important. And when you're learning your times tables, you're going, oh, 2 2s are 4, you know, 3 3 4. You're using your sounds, and you're using your inner speech. So you've got that kind of sound component, if you like, to working with your memory. On the other hand, you've got the visual. He calls it a visual cache, and we'll explain later why we don't quite like that term. But the visual cache is the, if you like, the mental imagery. So the way that you're processing visual information and your visual storage as well. And then you've got what he calls the central executive. And the central executive is the the part of your working memory that's really thinking, well, am I going to go to the sound part, or am I going to go to the visual? Where am I going to put my attention? And the central executive is making those sorts of choices around that. Now, the phonological loop is called a store on that model, but it's usually called the phonological loop, isn't it, as opposed to a store, because the working memory doesn't really store information as such. So, but on that diagram, it's called the store. So from the phonological loop, you've got your inner speech, and that will go into long-term memory. So if you're practicing 2 2s are 4, 3 4s are 12, and so on and so, that will eventually go into long-term memory. Then you've got your visual memory. So you're looking at things, and perhaps you looked at those numbers beforehand, and did you remember them visually? And that will go into your long-term memory, that through the visual way. And originally that was all he had with his working memory model. And then he decided he needed an episodic buffer. And we were talking about that this morning, weren't we? We're really still not quite clear on what the episodic buffer is, but I've got a quote from Badley here. He sees it as where streams of information can be combined. So the information from your phonological store, the information from the visual cache is then being processed, being combined with through the episodic buffer, and then reaching long-term memory that way. So that's the sort of, he describes it as a somewhat like a stage on which everything happens, or a screen on which events are projected. So that's Baddeley's basic model. And we just had so many questions. And as a teacher, I had so many questions about, well, how is that working? How does that affect children's learning? What does it mean when, we hear about phonological deficits for people with dyslexia, or visual processing disorders? And I'm thinking, well, where is the disorder, and what is the deficit, and how do each one of those really work, so that we can find out
what does it really mean? What
does it really mean in terms of what's happening inside your brain?
And again, especially for the children who are so talented in so many other areas, that actually still involve these parts of the brain. So, they're not just general learning difficulties. And I do know there are children out there who have global learning difficulties, and we're not necessarily talking about those. We're talking about the kids or the people who have such amazing talents and are brilliant carpenters or artists or sports people, or they're great at science and maths, but they're not great at English, or vice versa. That they're able to use, obviously, these parts of the brain very, very well in other contexts, but just in the context of some of the basic skills they seem to be missing. So our question was, well, what's missing, and why is it missing? What's actually happening instead? So we were sort of looking up to go, well, what was the definition, an actual definition of working memory deficit then? When that comes up in a report, what does it actually mean? Of course, my battery on my phone is about to go. Can't believe it.
Oh no!
That's okay.
Plug it in somewhere, Sarah.
We'll keep going.
Through this, if you want to sort out your phone.
That's okay. We'll just keep going. And so, just bear with me 1 second. We couldn't find an absolute definition of it. So what we did was we kind of reverse engineered from the definition of working memory. We said, well, if this is what working memory is, then a deficit means it's got to be not working, very well. So do you want to explain a little bit?
Yeah, so basically, what is the working memory? So the working memory is the part of the brain which is going to really make sense of what you're trying to learn. So it's going to encode, it's going to make sense of what's coming in to your brain. It's going to send it off for storage, and it's actually going to be able to retrieve data. So if you're working on a maths problem, for example, you need to learn, or you need to retrieve information that you know about how to do multiplication, how to do addition, what's going on there. So if you can't do that, so if the working memory deficit is that you're really not able to make sense of the information that's coming in a logical way. And then the way that you store that information is really not effective. It's like having your filing cabinet in a complete mess with files all over the place. A bit like Sarah's desktop, I think so.
Yeah, my desktop definitely reflects my brain and the way my memory works.
And,
The number of times we can't find things that we've worked on is a bit scary, to be honest. But yeah, absolutely. So it's about,
and it's really hard to find the information as well. So to retrieve the data. So it's how you're making sense of things, how you're juggling different bits of information to solve a problem inside your brain, how you're storing the information that you're learning or that you've learned, and then how you get it back.
If you're storing it, I mean,
if you're storing it, because it might be going. So if the deficit is that these things are just not working properly, they're just not working effectively and efficiently.
Absolutely. And so we were looking to see, well, how is working memory actually tested? Like how did someone come up with this idea that someone has a poor working memory? And from what we can understand, and look, we're not educational psychologists, we're not assessors, so just want to say that this is from what we've talked to educational psychologists about and what we've researched and what we found. And there probably are other tests as well, but these seem to be the main ones.
Yeah.
So one is about a digit span, and it's remembering digits forward and digits backwards. It's letter and number sequencing to be able to remember that, and also to be able to test the spatial awareness, that spatial memory. So what we can see is that there are these tests where you have these colored squares, and people have to remember the position and the color, and they kind of change in knowing if it's different. Okay, so this might ruffle a few feathers, and we're okay with that, because if you want to, if you just absolutely can find a way to kind of prove us wrong, we're happy with that too. This is a discussion. We're not delivering a lecture here. What we want to talk, what we are sharing with you is the discussions that Paul and I have had.
Yeah, we're just sharing because we just like asking questions, really. We've got this insatiable curiosity for what's going on and what does that mean, and what's the purpose?
Yeah, you know, we want to drill down, because when we really understand something, then we can change it. If we don't understand it, then you know, we're not big fans of labels. So for us, a label, as we said, doesn't give a solution. It's not inherent inside the label. We want to know actually what is going on. So what we started to look at was, well, hang on a minute, what else is going on? And we came across this theory, cognitive load theory, which started to make a little bit more sense to us. We're like, okay, so we've got our original Baddeley model, the four-step Baddeley model, where we have working memory, but what else is actually going on, and what's the connection with the long-term memory? And so in this theory, what they start talking about is actually how much information from the long-term memory is being used in the working memory. And the more information you can actually access from the long-term memory, the lower the cognitive load. Now, this is really, really important to understand, because often those initial working memory tests are brand new, they're testing somebody's brand new information. You're shown something for the first time. This is not something that you already know. It's not something that you've already learned. It's not something that you've already memorized. This is brand new information coming in, and then it's testing, can you, you know, whatever time frame afterwards, you know, can you remember it? So for us, what's being tested is not working memory at all. Because if you were testing somebody who knew all of the characters from their favorite TV series, and you said, right, I'm going to test, you know, so these are the names, and you already knew that, and you came back to it, you were like, yeah, I know that, because it's in there. It's already stored. It's already in the filing cabinets. It's already in the system. So how much information you're actually using from long-term memory is going to determine the cognitive load, how much work the working memory actually has to do. If it's brand new information, you don't even have a filing cabinet or even a file set up yet for this data. It's just data coming in that's brand new. The brain doesn't know what to do with it and where to put it. So the networks are not established yet in the brain. And it's like, I would say learning something new is like going through an overgrown field. You know where you want to go. You can like, yeah, that's where I want to go. And the first time you go through, there's brambles and there's broken bicycles and thorns and, you know, tall grasses, and you might lose your way a little bit and everything else. But the more often you actually walk that path, then it becomes easier, it's flattened, it gets quicker and quicker and quicker. And eventually, I mean, you could really create a motorway, couldn't you? through a field, and boom, you can just access the information really, really quickly. So those networks have to be built, and they can be built in lots of different ways. There's not just one way of doing it. We have rehearsal here, but again, we don't believe, this is just our idea, guys, we don't believe that rehearsal is what's happening in the working memory. We believe it's happening earlier in terms of holding information. So this is playing part of actually, okay, let's just go on and see, well, what are we doing? Oh, goodness me, I was animated. I apologize for this. Oh, goodness me. Okay. So this was not meant to all arrive in one go. Apologies, that was supposed to be animated, but let's just go through it anyway. So here's a classic example of how often too much information is presented. Definitely. In one go, and it's not, it's very. And you don't quite know where to put your attention. I'm sort of looking at what's happening in my mind. Where do I put my attention? How do I do this? And yes, you're sort of swamped with all that overload, aren't you? And that is the cognitive overload, when the working memory is trying to make sense of it. What the hell's going on? Why is there so much information here? Yeah. Because here's some stuff that we know. Okay, so if we start on the left-hand side of the screen, this is the outside world, and this is information coming in. So this is the data that we're bringing in through our 5 senses. So we're seeing, we're hearing, we're touching, we're smelling, and we're tasting. Those are the only channels really that we can bring information through, that we can measure. Okay, and we know that our attention in any kind of moment, reality, that kind of sensory information coming in, the duration is actually less than a second. But the capacity, how much information we can actually process through our senses, is actually over 11 million bits of information per second. So we have a huge amount of information coming in, but our actual kind of sensory memory, memory is probably the wrong word really until we get to long-term memory. But our sensory processing is really, it's very, very fast. It's just all this information is flowing and it's coming through us. So what we then come into is our short-term memory. Now, some sensory information can go directly to the long-term, can't it, Paula? If it's very emotional, if there's a lot of emotion connected. Yeah, it depends where the significant thing here is the attention. So where is your attention at the moment? And obviously, if something really quite traumatic happens, then your attention is going to be there, and that particularly if the amygdala is activated, the freeze flight mechanism, then it can go straight into long-term memory, and that's how you get post-traumatic stress, for example, because those sensory memories are so vivid. We're not talking about unconscious memory. We're talking now about learning and thinking. We're talking about what's happening that we're conscious of. So we have a short-term memory, and this is where a lot of confusion came in, and we've read all around the place. Find what's the difference between short-term and working memory, and the interesting thing is that quite often they are actually thought of as being the same thing. They really are, because we were getting ourselves really tied up in knots about this, weren't we? Sort of, how can we make sense of the short-term memory, which I understand is like if you're ordering a round of drinks in a bar, and you need to remember the round of drinks, or you're not at the moment, anyways, or you're trying to remember somebody's name or a phone number that you need to write, or you need to remember the phone number to get upstairs to write it down. So that's your short-term memory, and then the working memory is more like manipulating it. We were so confused. We just said what's going on, and the reason we were really trying to find the difference was because we were saying, well, how much information can the working memory actually handle? What is its capacity? And what is its duration? Because we kept finding the same research from all over was showing the same thing, that short-term memory is only about 15 to 30 seconds. It literally, it's in and it's out, maybe up to half a minute later. And we can process consciously in our short-term memory about 40 to 50 bits per second. So we have 11 million bits coming through our senses, through our neurology. But our conscious mind can only pay attention. We have a little tiny window. We can only pay attention to about 40 to 50 bits. So first of all, we now know that everyone's probably paying attention to a different 40 or 50 bits. You have a classroom full of 25 to 30 children. You as a teacher might be saying, okay, this is what I'm teaching, but are they all paying attention? Probably not. Are they? Probably not. Are they all paying attention the same way? Definitely not. Everyone's got a different way of paying attention. So we're saying, well, if that's happening, and then once you have learned something, it goes into the long-term memory. So if this had been animated, what would have come up then was long-term memory. because this is where we are storing information unconsciously. So this, once we've learned it and we've decided to store it, we then have to put it somewhere. So here's the data coming in. Hopefully we've put it into a file, and then it's where does it go into the filing? You know, which filing cabinet does it go into? And the brain loves connections, so it's always like, well, hopefully we've figured out a way to organize information so we can then retrieve it. And before it goes in there, it actually goes through a part of the brain called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus, we're going to come back to a little bit later, because it's nicknamed the learning organ, because we know that everything comes through the hippocampus in terms of being stored and being retrieved. So actually the encoding actually happens in the hippocampus. That's where it's going on, the processing. So here was our question: what's actually going on then between the short-term memory and the long-term and the hippocampus? Because it can't just go from 40 to 50 bits per second with this very, very short duration, then into this, and if you look at the bottom of the big blue box, you can see the duration of your long-term memory can be a few minutes to your entire life. You know, I can still remember the phone number of where I lived in the 80s, and I am that old.
I go further back than that.
You know, and I said, well, I will never forget. There are things that you will never ever forget. They are absolutely inside your long-term memory, and the capacity. And again, we were looking for this information. Is that it appears it's limitless. So we go from this tiny duration, tiny capacity, to this basically virtually infinite. So
yes, short-term memory is really, it just gets deleted, doesn't it?
Just gets deleted.
And not a storage at all.
You know, I know not that long ago, until I started taking some multivitamins that were helping me, I was getting to the top of the stairs and completely forgetting, you know, and it took me less than 15 seconds to get to the top of the stairs, and I would completely forget why I was there. Sure. You know, like complete gone into an abyss, you know. So my short-term memory really was struggling a little bit in terms of, you know, what was going on. So our question is, what is going on between the short-term memory and the hippocampus? What is actually happening in terms of how we learn? And what we are proposing is that the working memory is distinct from the short-term memory. The working memory is essentially the workshop. It's where the thinking and learning is happening. And if we bring in cognitive load theory, what we're saying is the more information you can access easily from your long-term memory, depending on the task and what you already know and the deep learning that's happened around that, the less cognitive load your working memory then has to handle. If you are learning something brand new that you've never seen before, you have a higher cognitive load. It is more difficult. The working memory has to use a lot more energy. Whereas if you're engaging in something that you know really well, you've learned it, you've understood it, you understand the basic principles of it, then what's happening is actually your capacity of the working memory is actually increased, because you're using unconsciously a lot of information that you already know. So this is really, really important for people.
Yes, it is.
Struggling. Because the reality is, if we keep putting more and more cognitive load on the working memory, it looks like the working memory is not working properly.
That's right. And it was confusing for us, because when you look up capacity of the working memory, often they will be saying you can only remember like the 7 plus or minus 2, and more recent research said it's actually only 4 plus or minus 2, but that's short-term memory. And so that our confusion was, well, if the short-term memory is only remembering these tiny little bits for a very short period of time, how on earth can that be working? So it just wasn't helpful at all. So splitting them out into short-term memory and then the working memory, which is a very different animal, if you like, helped us, didn't it, to understand what was going on.
It really did, and we are both NLP practitioners and trainers, and in neurolinguistics, that stands for neuro-linguistic programming. You know, we go a lot more into how information is processed. You know, we look at all the different aspects in terms of, you know, our senses and everything else. And so we were bringing in our knowledge of actually how to coach people based on this model of communication that we have used. And what we are proposing is actually the working memory is totally fluid, and it'll change for each person from context to context, and even from moment to moment. So it's fluid. You cannot really measure it and say this is what it is for that person, because it's going to change. Like for me, if I started to learn a foreign language, if I started to learn, I don't know, Swedish, for example, I don't understand necessarily how the Swedish alphabet works. I've not heard a lot of Swedish apart from, you know, the odd film here and there. I have very little prior knowledge of it. My working memory would be in overload.
Oh gosh.
Someone just started speaking Swedish to me and expecting me to, you know, after one lesson, right, come on, off you go. And the reality is, of course, everyone can pretty much learn if it's important and if they want to, the motivation. But it all starts somewhere, and you have to sort of learn something, transfer it to long-term memory, learn something, transfer it to long-term memory, etc. And you're building up your knowledge store inside your working memory, and the bigger and the more and wider and deeper that goes, and the networks, because the brain doesn't work as one bit of one part of the brain, does it? It's all these networks, these cortices.
Exactly. It's through these networks, and later I think we use the word schemas, don't we? So you're learning Swedish, so you develop your kind of Swedish schema. So your knowledge about Sweden will build up over time, and you'll store the knowledge, what you see about Sweden, what you hear about Sweden, what you know the language. I mean, it'll be stored in the networks all over that link all over the brain, which is absolutely, you know, it's phenomenal, isn't it? And
it's incredible. I mean, it really, and again,
yeah.
it appears to be limitless. So you can't stop learning, really. And we know from neuroplasticity that we never stop learning in our lives.
Yeah, for sure.
That, you know, it's not true. You can teach an old dog new tricks.
Yeah, well,
well,
yeah.
Paula, you and I are
I'm still learning,
and we're still learning, and we're still absorbing information, but we're building, and that's why, you know, you have this thing about becoming a master of something. It's 10,000 hours, you know, or 10 years, and it's like, yeah, there's a reason for that, and that's because, you know, now there are probably ways of accelerating things, but really, you know, experience and knowledge and all of that is so important, because it's about how we make connections and how we see patterns with things as well. And that's what the brain likes. The brain doesn't like just individual little bits of information. It doesn't know what to do with it. It doesn't seem connected to anything. There's maybe no motivation to learn it. So let's introduce, and this one is animated. Can't even say it. Put my teeth back in. Animated. Thank God. Because this is what we are proposing that the working memory is. We are proposing the working memory is basically a mental workshop. It's where the thinking and learning happens. And as we said, it's fluid. It's going to go between, you know, a very high cognitive load when it's something brand new, and trying to hold. And that's why we had rehearsal over short-term memory. Because if you're remembering, trying to hold, you don't have a piece of paper and someone gives you a phone number and you have to go and dial it, you're repeating it, you're rehearsing it. You know, you're trying to see things inside your mind, you're trying to hold it. And there's a lot of work with that, you know. So the rehearsal really happens over there. But the thinking and learning, yes, there's probably a little bit of that repetition coming in too. Like if you're asked a question and you're going away to try to work it out, you might repeat the question to yourself. So there'll be that element, but then how do you think? How do you actually figure it out? So this is what we are proposing is going on. Yes, there is a visual element, absolutely. In fact, this is the one that we maintain as being one of the most important parts of the brain for learning. And we know from, again, research and looking at fMRI scans and everything else is that those with the likes of dyslexia, or even if they have Asperger's syndrome, I don't know if it's called that anymore. I think labels are always changing. Again, the label does not mean the solution. Is that a lot of people with those labels are highly visual thinkers. They see big picture. They're able to see lots of images at the same time. There's a lot going on visually. And but we all use the visual system, and we don't want to call it a cache, because the cache is short-term memory. It's what are we just holding. We're going to mental imagery. So the visual aspect is both what are we bringing in from the outside world, our external eye, what can we remember seeing, and what can we imagine seeing. So our creativity is also involved. So it's not, the visual system is all kinds of aspects in terms of internal, external, internal, and then what are we remembering, and what can we create, something brand new. And that goes on in the visual system. Yes, there is an auditory aspect. So we have this phonological loop. So a little bit, we were talking a bit about learning. I'm going to call them times tables because I'm just this kind of
that's fine.
maths facts.
Yeah.
You know, and when rote learning was the way to learn mathematical facts, anyone who's learned that way, and you were saying yourself, if you want to get to 6 times 7, you have to start at 6 times 1.
Yeah, so yeah, I've learned it in an order, and
Which
it's
is
really hard to just to dodge around. Yeah.
You want to go straight into that one. So because of that, because that is because auditory. So here's a quick thing, which is that visual is simultaneous and you know, all the information's there, boom, it's all happening at once. Auditory, it has to be sequential. You know, it's got to be in a particular order. It's like a phone number. It's got to be that order. If you rearrange some of the numbers, it's not the same phone number. So it's got to be in that order. It's like the words of a song. You know, when anyone's got an earworm, and you go like, what's the next bit? What's the next bit? And you're going to go back to the bit you know, and it's like trying to trigger that memory and everything.
Yeah.
So it is a loop. It kind of goes round. But we also know that there is a secondary, there's a second auditory aspect, which is how do you talk to yourself? You know, you've got a running commentary, you've got an internal dialogue going on in a speech that is separate from that just holding how something sounds. Because the phonological loop is not just words, it's also music, it's how things sound, etc., etc. So there's two slightly different elements in terms of auditory. One of the things that's missing out of the normal model is that actually these two elements, these three elements of our sensory systems, smells, taste, and the kinesthetic, the movement or muscle memory, whatever it is. And surely if we're bringing in information through our 5 senses, we're processing information through our 5 senses as well. Now, again, depends on the task, it depends on the context, it depends on why we're doing something as to how much of this we use. Obviously, when we're learning our maths facts, we don't really need our smell and taste, but some people still use their fingers. You know, they're using the kinesthetic, and that's okay at the beginning, isn't it? Like, it's really good because it's a really tangible way of you know, counting or.
Yes, and you often use songs and move and dance to learn. So
Yes, and when we talk about, you know, multisensory learning, this is why. It's because, yes, our senses are not just external, they're also internal as well. So how are we actually processing information, you know, really helps to incorporate all 5 of these elements that are actually going on. Yes, there is a central executive. Now, the central executive is so complex, isn't it, Paula?
Oh, another talk, I think.
Yeah, we will. If we just talked about central executive today, we would really take up the rest of this time, and we will talk about it because it's really, really key. But just think of the central executive as the decision maker as to, well, how much attention are you going to pay externally and internally? How much are you going to access in terms of your long-term memory, and how much are you going to bring in that's new? You know, and it involves motivation, it involves, you know, beliefs. You know, what do you believe is important? Your values. I mean, it's huge. It's not just this kind of arbitrary thing. And the good news is, when you understand how many elements there are of it, you only have to pick one to make a big change. It's not like you have to change everything. You can actually kind of go into the central executive and go, okay, let's have a look at motivation, let's have a look at beliefs, and that can make a substantial difference. And this is really something that is missing in most learning theories. The emotional state. How you are feeling will have a massive impact.
Huge impact on your working memory.
What you're paying attention to, how much you're learning, how much you're able to retrieve. And many of you who know me and have attended a training know my story of my physics A-level, where it was my best subject. I like to boast that I was top of the class, but there was only 3 of us, so it's not much of a boast, is it really? But I knew it. It was my best subject, my favorite subject. But because I was so nervous when I went in, it was the first of all the A-level papers. And I went in and I completely panicked. And I can still remember today that feeling of just this concrete or this kind of steel shutter coming down. And even though I had the information in my long-term memory, I could not for the life of me bring it in.
Just couldn't retrieve it.
Could not retrieve it. And I was having a conversation with myself. You know this, and this part was going, I know it, but where is it? And the more stressed I got because I couldn't remember it, the less I could actually remember. And I'm sure everyone can relate to that story.
Oh, everybody can relate to that, for sure.
In some way, shape or form. So the hippocampus, which is the learning organ, is directly impacted by our emotional state. This is so crucial to understand. And I saw a great expression, which was, brains in pain can't learn.
That's a good one. I haven't heard that, but yeah, that's right.
But why? And it's like, yeah, I get that, but why? Why is because our emotional state is directly related, inversely related, really, to our ability to code and encode information, send it into the long-term memory, and retrieve it as well. Because let's face it, if you think you're in danger, the last thing you need to be able to do is remember a physics formula. It's the central executive is going, no, you're in danger. You need to do whatever you need to do to get out of there. So what we're saying is that the working memory is a combination of all of these that will change depending on what you're doing, and why you're doing it, and your emotional state and what's happening and everything else. And it is related, and it'll be somewhere on this continuum between your short-term memory, new information coming in, and what you already know. And that's why what we are proposing is that the working memory is both fluid in capacity, how much information you can deal with and you can process, and duration, because you can be thinking about a problem actually for a lot longer than 15 to 30 seconds.
That was our confusion, wasn't it? What led us along this path to asking these questions?
So one thing that we know is that if you only test one element of this, and in the short-term memory, so high cognitive load, short-term memory, and that person fails, and you then say they have a working memory deficit, the reality is that's probably not true. It's not a deficit, it's the task is not really a true representation of how can we test all of this, and really why. The more you can actually learn and put into your long-term memory, the less cognitive load you have. So I know it's probably a little bit provocative at the beginning to say, why is it important to know your times tables? And I love maths, and I do a lot of maths tutoring. And one of the things that I often see is that if someone is in secondary school and they're struggling with their maths, is immediately I will ask them, okay, do you know your multiplication tables? Do you know them off by heart? And invariably, if they're struggling, particularly with algebra, which a lot of people freak out at, is that they don't know their multiplication tables. They haven't really learned the relationship between those numbers, so they can't do. Therefore, division becomes much harder.
Oh, for sure.
And people say, but we have a calculator, we have computers. You can have a table. However, what you're doing is you are overloading the working memory with now kind of something that seems to be new. It's not coming in from the long-term memory, and it takes longer, and it becomes much more difficult, and then the emotional state goes down in terms of, people feel worse, and it becomes very stressful, and then it doesn't work. So we know that we have a way through mainly visual rather than rote learning of helping people to learn their multiplication their maths facts, whether it's adding, subtracting, or multiplying, dividing. And it's the same with spelling, isn't it, Paula, as well? Like,
Oh, absolutely, because
spelling is seen as not important.
Yeah, so the two things that are really central to this is how much can you get into the long term effectively and efficiently, and particularly that the memory that you're talking about is the automaticity, the stuff that you just know. It's automatic, and that's that's the procedural memory, as well as remembering facts and things and stuff, which is a different sort of memory. So the long-term memory is those two things going on there. The more that you can get automatic, the more that you can get effectively and efficiently filed away and stored so you can retrieve it, is going to be key in making the working memory capacity greater. The other two really important things are to use the auditory aspect and the visual aspects together. And
there is a term for that. I mean, people have actually.
Yeah. It's called dual coding. Dual coding. And see, this is not happening early on. If you think about how we teach phonics in school at the moment, which is the bedrock of learning how to spell and how to read, then it's basically auditory. Even before they start to think about letters and words, they do sound awareness. So you'll take the children out and you'll listen for sounds. This is to really get this working, get the auditory channel working well. And then a lot of how you're hearing is, tough if you are hard of hearing or you've got glue ear or something. But anyway, that's another story. But what we're not doing is actually training the visual part, the mental imagery, and we're not getting the auditory processing and channels to work with the visual channels together. And this is absolutely key. And so what we suggest is that we need to really embed that visual training alongside the auditory training, and by separating them out and saying there's an auditory deficit or there's a visual processing deficit which is leading to a working memory deficit, you go, well, that was our question, wasn't it? You go, well, what is going on?
Because I can guarantee you this: if someone tested my auditory short-term memory, I would look like I can't learn anything.
Oh, and I'm the same with visual. Well, I'm better now because of the stuff that I've done over the years. I've trained myself to be more visual and to have a better visual memory. I wish I'd just known that by using the two together, by using the dual coding, using those two different modalities together, we can really reduce the stress on the working memory.
Absolutely. As soon as we kind of made this connection and we started to see things that were kind of supporting what we were saying, but no one had really brought all of this together in this way. To me, it was like, but that's common sense. it's like, yeah, of course, the more we know, the more we've learnt, the more automaticity we have, the more that we've got automatic recall. Now, I'm not saying that you should then start testing your child to be the quickest they possibly can be to get maths facts and everything else. But I understand what the purpose of that is, and it is about automaticity. The problem, of course, is getting it in. The problem is how it's being delivered or how it's being taught isn't matching. And remember, our definition of our kind of quote in terms of what we see learning difficulties as is they're not actually learning difficulties. They're a discrepancy between how information is being presented, how someone is being taught, and actually how they learn, because everyone's learning differently.
Absolutely. And it's getting this
one way that's focusing on only one element of this.
Yeah. Because so much of that, so much of that early teaching of basic reading and spelling and maths is auditory based, with a bit of kinesthetic thrown in, jolly phonics, and you're making the actions and so on. But what is really missing in that early teaching is how do you develop those mental imagery skills, and how do you work them alongside the auditory so that they complement each other and work together within the working memory. And then you really reduce that cognitive load. And also, very importantly, that we find, we were searching for, why does our process work? Our process for teaching spelling, which links the image with the word, and we hadn't found any research around that until quite recently. And there's something really important about not having you increase the cognitive load if you put the sound and the vision separately, you deliver it separately, or if you have two visuals. For example, if you've got a science diagram of the heart, and you label the heart and the ventricles and whatever, the aortas, separately around the outside, it's not the same as actually putting the label on it, because you want to reduce that cognitive load.
And you found some research to back that up.
Yes, absolutely. Which
visuals were created as one picture.
Yeah.
So reducing the load is now a whole. So just want to take a little step back, which was that. So that 11 million bits of information, by the way, that's coming in through our senses, 10 million of that approximately comes through our sight. 10 million out of 11 million. So our eyes, our sight is essentially the most powerful channel for bringing information in. And I love the expression, a picture is 1,000 words.
Absolutely.
You see something in an instant, but to describe it takes a lot more. And the rest of the senses make up 1 million together. So our visual system is so powerful, but is really underrated actually as the way in for so many people to actually then be able to hook other things onto it. So a picture is much easier to actually process and to remember than sounds and that kind of loop and having to, you know, so repetition, drilling often actually is more the phonological loop. It's not really the mental imagery.
And if that works with the visual, then that's even stronger.
Speed it up.
But what we do is really say, okay, that's the visual. You can present information visually, but what is actually being received inside the brain? And that's the big difference with us, isn't it? So when you say you were to do an assessment, do a digit span, and the child wasn't able to recall those digits in order, we would be asking, what exactly did you see? What exactly did you hear? What was going on for you? What did you feel inside?
How did you feel? Absolutely.
How did you feel? How did you see? What sounds did you hear? What was going on? What was going on inside the brain? Because just to say, oh, you didn't sequence that, you didn't remember, oh, bam, deficit. But we haven't investigated, we haven't unpicked it, we haven't examined it. What exactly is happening inside there?
Output measured against input. Without any real exploration as to what's actually happening and what happens when they know something really well.
Yes.
You know, I mean, there are so many children out there who are brilliant at gaming. You know, they can play.
Oh my gosh.
They can play whatever game it is. Now, I have two boys who like to game, and I sit in there and I haven't got a clue what's going on. And I'm wondering, how are they processing that split screens? They've got all kinds of stuff going on. They've got to know the rules. They're looking at, there's numbers all over the screen. And yet you go, okay, and some children who are brilliant at that can't spell. You go, okay, there's something missing here, and it's not inside their brain. It's actually how the information is being processed. And if you can teach someone to process the information differently, to access their visual mental imagery, to be able to control it, to be able to link things to it, what we see, and we know we've seen it over and over and over and over.
Oh, we've seen it work. I'm just aware of the time. We've got just over 5 minutes, so
a bit to go. There's no questions coming in, but that's okay. Maybe everyone was just sitting there with their jaws on the table. That's okay. But when we just started talking about this and playing around with this model, we just said, surely someone else has come up with it. Surely someone else is talking about this in that way. And if there is someone out there, well, they're not at the forefront, because when we done Google Scholar searches, we've just really come up short in terms of finding something that has married in so many different theories to look at a more holistic, take a more holistic approach to learning and thinking, rather than trying to find what bit of the brain is not working. It's like, no, these are systems, these are connections, these all work together, and as long as you're testing them together, you're probably going to get a much more accurate result in terms of actually what that person's capacity is for that, whatever it is you're testing. It's not for everything. You know, when the stuff I know that I've been studying for nearly 20 years, I know really, really well. I mean, we didn't have any rehearsal of what we were going to talk about, but information comes out, and when you're flowing, and you know, when I teach, it's you know, it's all in there. Whereas if you said, right, stand up and teach about rocket science, can't do it. So you've got to think about its context and content dependent. What is it you actually know? So just trying to process, think I have to watch again. This is Anne-Marie. Thanks, Anne-Marie. Someone saying, in your thoughts around performance, digit span, what does it mean to have, assessors when giving this test? So we're not going to bash teachers or assessors or anyone else. Just so you know, this is all about what is currently accepted as being. And thanks, Mary. So this is what is currently accepted, and this is built into the assessments of children who are struggling. So what does it mean? Well, for us, the digit span is short-term memory test. It's not working memory test. That's basically what we're saying, that if this is a brand new digit span that child has never seen before, and then you're looking to test whether they can remember it, that's short-term memory, because it's not known, it's not you know, and for some students as well, if their visual, their mental imagery is not stable, they might even be reversing the numbers. They might be flipping them, you know, so maybe a 6 looks like a 9, or they're transposing them. I know one of the adults who was on my research project, this was a really interesting thing. So again, because I was going in forensic investigation, what was happening was he was a cattle farmer, and he would look at a cow, and he would see the tag on the ear, but when he would go to write down the number of the cow, he would write down the mother's number. And I was like, so he said, yeah, because when I'm looking at that cow, I know where that cow comes from. And he could remember the mother's number. And he actually got fined €10,000 for writing down the wrong number of some of his cattle. And it wasn't because he deliberately did it. It was that when he looked down at the page to write, that was the number that came into his head. So if you're, that short-term memory is there's a challenge. So what we do is we're not testing short-term memory. We're looking at how we can develop the working memory.
Yeah, and look, sorry, if I could just quickly come in there, because if you're giving children a digital span to how many digits can you remember in sequence, and then even reverse the sequence. But what I'm saying is that that's okay for a test. You can test it for whatever reason you want to do, because yes, we need to hold that. But what we're not doing is then saying, okay, well, how can we teach you to do that better? And we haven't got those tools then. I mean, I certainly didn't have them in the kind of 40 years I was. So we need to say, well, okay, when you look at that digit span, what are they doing? Are they able to hold the visual image? Because that's what people who've got a good working memory, that's what they can do naturally without being taught. And we say, oh, wow, aren't you brilliant? Aren't you bright? Because I can show you a sequence of numbers, and your brain just seems to magically, if you like, get that network.
The photographic memory. The
photographic memory thing. And what we're saying is that some people don't have that. We're quite right. We're saying it's not a deficit. It's just that they haven't been taught. They don't know that that's what you need to do. And they don't know that in order to remember that sequence of numbers, or letter number sequence, have they got a stable emotional state? Can they form the image inside their mind's eye? You know, how do you manipulate that? And these are skills, these are basic visual processing skills that actually need to be explicitly taught, and they can be explicitly taught. Sorry, I'm getting a bit passionate now.
I know, this is our soapbox though, Paula. This is
I'm getting a bit passionate now, because I know I didn't, I suppose it's a bit of, I don't do guilt, but I reflect on the fact that I didn't have this knowledge, and I didn't have these tools when I was teaching. And to be honest, it breaks my heart that I didn't have this knowledge then, because I just think how many more young people I could have helped over the years. So anyway, off my soapbox, I shall calm myself down.
So we're not going to get off till we stop recording, so that's okay. Lucy says, end the reading war. Dual coding use both auditory and visual modalities, combining sound and image channels.
Yeah.
Learning reduces strain on the working memory. Lucy, don't worry, we're going to come back to that in a minute. So Mary is just asking here, sorry, I have to just extend that. Do you see any difference between forward and backward digit span performance in terms of what is being tested, or are they both short-term activities? Yes, they're both, they're both short-term and long-term. And anyone who's done the jump starting process knows that what we do when we are teaching spelling is we use dual processing. Actually, we use multiple processing. It's not just dual, because it's auditory, visual, and meaning. So you have to understand the meaning of a word. And when we look at the letters, it's memorizing how the letters in that word actually look, where are they, and then being able to test them in reverse, not transpose them, but actually test them in reverse to see, are we testing the visual? Now that sounds really simplistic and everything else, but if you haven't signed up for the online training, it's free for parents. You can go in, we explain the whole thing. What's really interesting is then children can, you start with 3-letter words, and then you go to 4 and 5, and you're building this working memory muscle essentially. So each one of these is a muscle, and it's like going to the gym. You know, you can't just be shown how to do something and then you know it. You've got to build it up. You can't just run a marathon. You've got to build it up. You know, so our brain is a muscle essentially, and the forwards and backwards is about how are we then storing it long term. There's not much point just being able to do something reverse short term, and then what do you do with it? you know, that's why we're not big advocates of non-words either, in terms of testing phonological processing, because that's only one little tiny aspect of working memory. English is tough enough with all the different pronunciations. You don't need, you're such a deep orthographic depth, you don't need to be able to test those things. It's got to be, you know, word dependent at the end of the day, and what does that actually mean? So, okay, oh my gosh, we've actually gone over time.
I know, come on.
Very, very quickly. So for those of you who played along, the slide that we showed at the beginning, what I want you to do now is I want you to just write down whatever you can remember. So find a piece of paper and a pen if you don't already have one. And if you're watching this recording, you can pause and actually just write down everything you can remember from it, okay? And look, we don't have too much time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you it again, and then you can see how much you got right. Now, a lot of you go, that's not what you showed us before. Actually, it is. If I was to go back to the original slide, what you'll see is this was cut up and rearranged on a page. And people are going, no, you didn't, no, you didn't. Go back onto the recording, and we don't have time to go back now, but I promise you it is. It was just rearranged on the page. So this is something very well known. This is a keypad. This is how numbers are generally presented. And no, there were no letters, they were all digits. And if I had shown you this, how long would it have taken for you to memorize it? 1 second. Because you're going, oh, it's a keypad. You know what a keypad is. You've seen it many, many times. You've stored it in your long-term memory. It's something you will never forget. So this is what we're showing you, is that if you just show something that has no connections, we don't know what the pattern is, we don't understand the meaning of it, it's just those arbitrary lines and numbers, it's not connected to anything, the brain will really, really struggle. But show things as a connection, show things as a pattern, link it in with the long-term memory, and boom, it's in. People often ask me, how is it I can remember so much from what I read? And it's because I'm always making connections. When I read something, I find which filing cabinet, which file does that information belong in? Those networks are already there. They're already strong. And I go over this material over and over again. I'm, you know, passionate about it. I'm building on it. I'm always using it. So the networks are kind of fresh, you know. So when I learn something, and I'm always thinking about stuff, as Paula knows, trying to rein me in is the problem, isn't it, Paula? So what's really interesting is that we have been asking, and I've certainly been asking since I was doing my research, you know, many years ago now, the role of emotion and motivation, that there's more going on inside of us than just these kind of visual, auditory elements that we can test. So this,
I think I'm gonna big you up here, because Sarah, when we started thinking about the working memory and sorting out what is it that we do that actually links in with the working memory, Sarah was saying, but where are emotions in this? Where are the emotions? Where's the motivation? And just the other day, actually, I found Baddeley himself in an interview said this.
Yeah, and it wasn't that long ago. This is quite recent.
Yeah, here's the 2000. So he says, if I was starting again, I would probably choose to work on the influence of emotion and motivation on working memory. And I said, this Sarah's been saying that. Cognitive psychology is principally concerned with the control of action. However, we also need to think about what is being controlled, why we act at all. And I think that's really going to lead on to next week if we talk about the central executive, because that is all about why we act, how we act, what's going on internally.
And what you can do if you're a parent, you know, with a child who's really struggling in terms of motivation and focus and all those things, you know, beliefs. And you know, I just know that, you know, we are all different. There is no one standard normal brain. And I think the more we try to sort of fit people into boxes and put a label on and just go, well, because they've got this assessment, they've got this label, now we understand it. It's like, no, we don't. Now you just know that they think differently. Now the question is, how do they think differently? And what can you do, either you yourself, if you've struggled, to really harness your strengths and your innate abilities, ones that are easy, the door that's open already in the brain. If you're a parent and your child is struggling, you know, and it's really heartbreaking, isn't it, to see, you know, as a teacher and as a principal, how heartbroken you were that there was some bright little, you know, beings that are just, you know, you're going, what is going on? And as a parent, you know, it's so awful to see your child struggle. And of course, now we have a huge emotional struggle going on for a lot of children, you know, being out of school. So it's really important. And I read a great article the other day, and it was a letter, and kind of an open letter to schools saying, you know, when the doors reopen and children are back at school, don't focus on trying to cram in the content that they've missed. Help them to deal with you know, the emotional trauma really that they have experienced from being separated from their friends, from being stuck at home with their parents. I know it's traumatic for my children to be at home with me all day.
I'm sure they're suffering.
and everything else, you know. So yeah, so next week we are going to talk a little bit more about that and what you can do as a parent, because when we look at our working model, is that the end of the slide? That is the end of the slides. When we go back to our model, we know that emotional state and central executive, you know, are absolutely key. And if you don't look at those first, and you're just trying to cram information in, and then you wonder why the child is not being able to regurgitate it and to remember it, we have to really have a little bit more of an investigation and a curiosity aspect to be able to do that. So yeah,
well, we've overrun, but hopefully
we have overrun by about 8 minutes. So we hope that everybody has enjoyed that it has been a little bit of an eye-opener, maybe a big eye-opener for a lot of people who are used to maybe delivering or doing assessments, and you know, this might be a bit uncomfortable because you might be thinking, what have I been doing? And it's like, there's nothing wrong, it's just there's more to it, there's more that we think is going on. And yeah, if there's any questions, you're more than welcome to contact us and email us, or to put a note on our page. Anne-Marie says, fascinating, thank you. You're welcome. Thanks, Anne-Marie. And I know,
thank you, Anne-Marie. Thank you for joining us.
Many years ago, working memory was something that, and it was when you said it, you went, oh, we've been focusing on working memory. And I was like, have you? And it was just actually, no, what we're really, now we know that actually what's being measured is short-term memory. So I think being able to separate those two out, it will just create a much more open pathway, you know, for people to be able to understand what's actually going on. So we are going to end there. I know we're 10 minutes over. Thank you for being with us. It's such an honor, again, to be able to just share what we have thought about and agonized over, and, you know, just try to get our heads around, you know, what's going on, and really try to simplify it right down to help people as much as possible. The course for parents is still free, and you can access it. We have the link above this talk. Even if you're a teacher, you're not a parent, or if you're an adult and you're struggling, it's still worth looking at, because we cover the actual process for those things. If you are a teacher, we do have teachers training that currently isn't free, but we are looking for sponsorship. So if anyone wants to sponsor us, be able to give this for free. If you're an organization, or you know, we would love to be able to do that, but we have our costs to cover in terms of the hosting of these courses. So we would appreciate really any help that we can get to be able to get this information out there. So please share this as well. Please feel free to share this with as many people as you think you know, would be interested, would find this useful. So until next week.
That's it. Until next week.
We are going to say goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you for joining us.